well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's presentation, From Film to Book, a look at film adaptations of sci-fi and fantasy books. We're going to explore some of the most successful and least successful film adaptations of sci-fi and fantasy books, including Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, King Arthur, Blade Runner, and The Hunger Games, with movie buff Frank Mandosa, who will share his popular presentation filled with photos, video clips, and trivia. Get ready for an evening of fantasy creatures, dystopian worlds, androids, wizards and magic, and other science fictions. So Frank is a full-time high school film and English teacher. He has been giving film lectures at libraries, senior centers, and community centers across the state for over 10 years. Frank is the host of the movie-themed podcast Screensavers and the co-host of Real Life, which is an award-winning local access TV show that features movie reviews. Again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, along with the libraries in Dracut and Lowell, for making tonight possible. So everyone who's watching live on Zoom and those that will watch later on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Frank for joining us here tonight. And Frank, you can take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for introducing me, Robert. And I also want to thank the Tewksbury Library, the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, as well as Lowell and Dracut, and of course you as well, Robert, for having me this evening. I really hope that I'll be sharing my passion for all things movie related, past and present and future, with you in a way that is user-friendly and just contagious as far as love of film goes, because what we'll be talking about tonight are some of the greatest stories ever committed to celluloid. So I don't need to repeat the title again. Here it is on the screen, and Robert just said it. So without further ado, let me advance to the next slide so we can dive right in. So again, I do have a movie-themed podcast called Silver Screeners. You can find it on most major podcast platforms. You can also join the Facebook film group Silver Screeners, and you can also contact me on Twitter and Instagram at the information you see here on the screen. And you can also email me at any time, anything movie related, at my podcast email, silverscreenerspod@gmail.com. The image that you see right here, where I'm looking admittedly rather silly, if you see that image, then you know you've come across the right one if you're searching for the podcast. So enough of the self-promotion though, and let's dive into what you came here for tonight. So what I'd like to invite you all to do is to go ahead into the chat. I'm going to have about 4 or 5 trivia questions here for you, and I'll pull them up one at a time. Go ahead and type your answer into the chat, what you think is the right answer. I'll give about 10 seconds, and then for the sake of keeping things moving at a reasonable pace, I'll give about 10 seconds, and then I'll tell you what the correct answer is. So the first question: which fantasy sci-fi story involves a wise mentor and a very simple, rather naive leading character who has no idea that they are destined for greatness? Are we talking about Harry Potter? Are we talking about Lord of the Rings, The Legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table? Or maybe we're talking about all of the above. Like I said, I'll give you about 10 seconds. Go ahead and type your response into the chat, and then I'll say what the correct answer is. Okay, and if you guessed that the correct answer is D, all of the above, then you are indeed correct, because it is a very, I'm not going to call it a cliche, but I will call it a formula. It's a formula where you have the underdog who is destined for greatness, humble beginnings, has no idea what greatness lies in store for them, has no idea what their fate holds in store for them, and they have a wise mentor who comes along and sort of takes them under their wing. In Harry Potter, you might say it's Gandalf. You might say that it's Professor Dumbledore. I said Gandalf. My apologies, that's Lord of the Rings. In Harry Potter, you might say it's Professor Dumbledore. In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, Merlin the Magician. The next question that I have for you here is, there are some images right there. The next question that I have for you is this one. Okay, Tolkien, who wrote the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books. When he was a student, a college student, he started a writing group called the Inklings. And does anybody know who also was a member of this writing group? Was it Ian Fleming, who went on to write the James Bond character? Ray Bradbury, who wrote Fahrenheit 451, among others, C.S. Lewis, H.G. Wells. And I will now pull up the correct answer. C.S. Lewis, the author of Out of the Silent Planet, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the entire series of Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, they were friends. They belonged to that same writing group called the Inklings. Moving forward now, considerable number of decades, we're now getting into a trivia question pertaining to the Hunger Games franchise. Jennifer Lawrence stars in the Hunger Game franchise as Katniss Everdeen. She also has another franchise, another movie franchise under her belt. Is it X-Men, The Dark Knight Trilogy, Guardians of the Galaxy, or The Expendables? And I can tell you now that the correct answer is X-Men. She also stars in the X-Men franchise, or some of them, not all of them, as the mutant shapeshifter named Mystique. So presumably that's either CGI or makeup on her face as Mystique. Clive Owen, Academy Award nominee Clive Owen. He plays King Arthur in the 2004 film version, which is simply called King Arthur, where you also have Keira Knightley playing Guinevere. Who was considered for the role of Arthur but turned it down? Was it Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Daniel Day-Lewis, Daniel Craig, or Pierce Brosnan? And if you're saying to yourself, you know what, I'm feeling the James Bond vibe thing going here, then you are correct. Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig was in consideration for the role of King Arthur, but he went on to do the James Bond franchise instead. Okay, in 2013, which writer published a picture book called Year of the Jungle, which deals with a period in their lives when they were roughly 6 years old and their father was actually deployed in Vietnam? Was it J.K. Rowling, Veronica Roth, Suzanne Collins, or Philip K. Dick? Who wrote this picture book? And I wish I could say drum roll, please, but instead I'll just pull up the correct answer. Suzanne Collins, who wrote the Hunger Games books, the Hunger Games trilogy. Year of the Jungle. Okay, 2005 saw Disney launching what they hoped would be a rival franchise for for Harry Potter. The Chronicles of Narnia, the first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was released in 2005. In the soundtrack of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you have a song called, I know the word is pronounced Wunderkind, but the singer pronounces it Wonderkind, and earned a Golden Globe nomination for the song. Was it Melissa Etheridge, Alanis Morissette, Adele, or Sarah McLachlan? It's probably a giveaway when I tell you that they deliberately mispronounce the word, because that's one of their trademarks with a lot of their albums. And the correct answer is Alanis Morissette. Alanis Morissette, she wrote Wunderkind, or Wunderkind, for the soundtrack and scored a Golden Globe nomination. Which of the following is true of Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling? Was it that over a dozen publishers were clamoring for the first Harry Potter book? She published using her initials because she was given advice that boys would avoid books if a female's name was written on the cover as the author. They said to her, you have to kill off certain characters, or all of the above true? And of these four, the true statement is B. Oops, I'm sorry. Is B. She published under her initials because she was told by the publisher, you know what? You're a woman, and if your name is on a book that we're going to be marketing towards young boys and girls, then we might have greater profitability if we have the fact that you're female sort of kept under wraps, which of course is ridiculous, but it's the way it was. It was 1997 when the first one was published. It's very rare that you will have in this genre of film the Academy honoring the actors with acting nominations, but it did happen every once in a while. And of these four, who received a rare Oscar nomination? Was it Maggie Smith, who was nominated for playing Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter? Was it Ian McKellen for playing Gandalf in Lord of the Rings? Was Harrison Ford nominated for Blade Runner? Or was Tilda Swinton nominated for playing the White Witch in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And the correct answer is Ian McKellen. Ian McKellen was nominated in the supporting actor category for the first Lord of the Rings film, The Fellowship of the Ring. And which of these fantasy sci-fi films is the only one not to be an Academy Award nominee for Best Picture? All of these were Best Picture nominees with the exception of which one? Which one is the non-nominee? And as unbelievable as it may seem, the movie not nominated for Best Picture of this list, Blade Runner. Blade Runner. But the rest were all nominated for Best Picture the year that they were initially released. Okay, so that brings a conclusion to the trivia portion. Let's now talk about the movies themselves. And I want to begin by throwing this rhetorical question out there. What is the purpose of storytelling, particularly with this kind of a genre where you have these fantastical worlds? Martin Scorsese caused a lot of, I guess controversy is a good word, but Martin Scorsese famously said a year or two ago that superhero movies are not real cinema. And some agreed and some didn't. But why bother telling stories? Why bother listening to them? You think about where we are now in 2022. You think about what life was like 200 years ago. I say this to my film students all the time. I always begin each semester by saying to them, a movie is more than just a movie. It doesn't matter if it is a slapstick comedy that is totally mindless. It doesn't matter if it is a self-serious superhero movie. It does not matter what kind of movie it is. Any movie is a time capsule. It is a time capsule. It's a time capsule of really an era. You think about all of the creative energies that go into storytelling. And it really is, it captures in a bottle trends, societal concerns, values, aspects of our culture that are reflected in the kinds of characters that we care about, the kinds of stories that are told. And you think about the way that movies have even been viewed over the past 100 years, from movie theaters to iPhone. I mean, we're streaming stuff on iPhones now. Who knows what it's going to be like 200 years from now in 22. But as it says, I love this quote, imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attractions. And I think that rings especially true for the sci-fi fantasy genre, honestly. Because this genre is all too often cast aside as, oh, those are the movies for, the so-called, oh, those are the movies for the, for the comic book nerds. Those are the movies for, I don't buy into any of that. A story is a story. A movie is a movie. A film is a film. Cinema is cinema. Inconceivable, as he says in The Princess Bride. So we have here another quote from C.S. Lewis. A children's story that can only be enjoyed by children is not a good children's story in the slightest. And as you'll hear when I talk to you a little bit about Narnia, particularly The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are elements of that story that really would either go over the heads of, or to give them more credit, would perhaps be a little bothersome to really young audiences. But for fantasy creatures, what I'd like to do, it was very difficult trying to determine the best way to organize all these films. With a big list, you can only include so much. You want to be mindful of time. You want to include the essentials. You also want to throw in a couple of surprises. So what I did was I categorized these films: fantasy creatures, and then films involving androids, just like the title of tonight's presentation. So we're beginning with fantasy creatures. So the first trio of films that I'll tell you a little bit about: E.T., The Dark Crystal, and The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I begin with this comic here because I love it. What's in the wardrobe? None of your business. And of course, it's Aslan the Lion. So first, E.T. E.T. was Steven Spielberg's pet project. Now, if you can believe it, he originally envisioned the story of E.T. to be a dark story about a family terrorized by a group of extraterrestrials left behind on Earth. Ultimately, he decided to go in the friendlier direction and have E.T. be this cute, vulnerable little space creature. And a lot of the ideas he had for the story of this family being terrorized, he threw in the direction of Poltergeist, which came out 1 week within E.T. As far as Spielberg himself is concerned, he has a fascination with extraterrestrials. That's no secret. You know, it's a repeated trend with a lot of his film. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., dare I say it, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the fourth one, even War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise. And E.T. Became, for a while, the #1 movie of all time, the highest grossing film of all time, dethroning Star Wars. And if you take a look at E.T. today, one thing that you may or may not have picked up on the first time you saw it is the fact that a lot of the camera shots are actually, the camera is actually at waist level for a lot of the grown-up characters, because he wanted to tell the story from the perspective of Elliot, of the perspective of a child, as opposed to having the more traditional close-ups of a lot of adult faces. I'm not saying the close-ups aren't there of the adults. What I'm saying is that you go back and you look at the film, there's a considerable number of shots where the adults are either in the shadows or they're seen really from the waist down. I can give you a specific example. When Elliot is, well, spoiler alert, when Elliot is on Halloween night, when he returns to the house and he's sick and the mother's talking with the cop, you only see the cop from the waist down. You never see the cop's face. So with that said, I'd like to show for you right now, this is the re-release trailer, actually, for E.T. This is the 20th anniversary trailer. So this would have been 2002.
He's lost. He's alone. And he's 3 million light years from home. In spring 2002, only in theaters,
I'm keeping him.
Steven Spielberg's masterpiece will come to life.
Home.
For a whole new generation. Experience the mystery.
Wait, what is it? I don't know. Something scary.
The wonder.
What's happening?
The call.
E.T. Phone home.
That started it all. With never-before-seen footage, enhanced special effects, and an all-new digitally remastered soundtrack. The extraordinary 20th Anniversary Edition. E.T., the Extraterrestrial.
I'll be right here.
Only in theaters, March 2002.
And yes, there is a novel version of E.T. written by William Kotzwinkle. That's K-O-T-Z, Kotzwinkle. I remember having it as a little kid, and there were scenes in the novel that did not make it into the film, and vice versa. a lot of scenes actually are told from the mother's perspective, which is interesting given what I just told you about how Spielberg wanted cinematically to tell the story from the children's perspective. But there is a novel version, so look it up at your local library. William Coxwinkle is the author. 1982, the same year of E.T., also saw The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal. Now, I could get into the details of the story, but for the sake of time, I'll just simply say that The Dark Crystal came out in 1982, and it was done by the Jim Henson Company. Jim Henson and Frank Oz, of course, the geniuses behind the Muppets, and as well as Sesame Street and all of those shows. The Dark Crystal is aptly titled because it's really not a story for little kids. It's dark. it just is. There's a lot of disturbing sequences, scary looking creatures. I remember talking to my brother-in-law about a year ago, asking him, "Do you remember that movie?" And he said, "Oh yeah." He says, "I like it now, but as a kid, it freaked me out." So there are some scary elements to it. I have here a quotation from Frank Oz, who said, "Jim Henson thought it was fine to scare children. He didn't think it was healthy for children to always feel safe." So interesting take on it, seeing as how this is the same guy who created Miss Piggy. But here is the trailer for The Dark Crystal for your enjoyment.
In a place outside time lies a mystical realm of sound and vision. A wondrous civilization. Where good and evil struggle to possess the Dark Crystal.
There was actually a short-lived prequel series that was, I want to say it was an Amazon series. I'd have to fact check that, but it came out in 2019. It lasted one season, but it was a prequel series to this film. Okay, moving now into C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, his full name, Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in Ireland. I have here some background information, some biographical stuff, but again, for the sake of time, I'll just keep moving forward with it. I do want to highlight the fact that he left Christianity. He was born a Christian. He left Christianity at the age of 13 for a while, for about 20 years. At the age of 33, he rededicated himself to his Christian faith. And you see elements of that in, among other books of his, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, I have here listed all of the titles in the Narnia series: Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Magician's Nephew, and so on. But we're going to focus primarily on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which, even though it's not the first one in the timeline of the series of books, it is the first one that the Disney studios decided to put into production about 16, 17 years ago. It was released in 2005. And as I already said, the intention was, let's see if we can have this sort of be, Disney Studios will have Narnia, Warner Brothers will have the Harry Potter series, and let's see who can duke it out of the box office. All of the books were actually he actually dedicated them all to, with the exception of the last battle, to his goddaughter, whose name is Lucy. And the little girl in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, indeed, her name is Lucy as well. And what makes this story have Christianity intertwined into it is really through the character of Aslan, the lion. He sacrifices his life in order to save Narnia and all who live there. He is somehow able to, through a series of events that I won't get into, he is the savior. He is the redeemer. There are themes of betrayal, so you definitely have the Judas aspect of it, and then forgiveness and redemption. Now, the Narnia story, it's not so, I mean, it is in the book, but especially in the Disney film plays it up a bit more. The fantasy world of Narnia is really sandwiched in between the story of the real life Blitz. It takes place during the war years, World War II England, and you have four siblings, the Pevensie children, and Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter. And the four of them are sent out of London by train to the countryside, which is what really happened during the Blitz, children being sent out to the countryside to live with these people who would sign up to take them in for their safety because of the horrific bombings of London. So in the context of this fictional story, these four siblings are sent to the house of a professor. And one day the four of them are playing hide and seek. And that is when little Lucy goes into a room that is the quote unquote forbidden room. And she sees something rather mysterious, a wardrobe. So just a little taste of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I will say this, the house that I live in, we bought it, we moved into this house probably about 7 years ago. And we have a lamppost out in our backyard that looks just like the one in the movies. So to this day, I keep calling it the Narnia light. Somebody left the Narnia light on, go turn it off. So there's even a picture of us holding our hand up to it. But that's a story for another day. So moving into the category of dystopian worlds, the two book series that became film franchises that seem to be the best fit here: The Hunger Games and Divergent. Veronica Roth wrote the Divergent series. Suzanne Collins wrote the Hunger Games books. So, Suzanne Collins, 2008. So she actually got her career got started, if you can believe it, with Nickelodeon. Clarissa Explains It All, a lot of preschool TV she wrote for. So the author of The Hunger Games got to start writing episodes of Clifford's Puppy Days, if you can believe it. She, at the time, it was 2008, so she was seeing a lot of news footage that was disturbing to her, war coverage. She also saw a lot of reality TV. I mean, we still have reality TV now, of course, things like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. She saw like Survivor and shows like that. And so in her mind, you know, with her creative juices, she said, I think I see a connection here, a connection between the innocence of childhood and how the innocence is lost once, you know, some of the brutalities of this world learned. So the seed of the idea of the Hunger Games was born. Now, the premise of the Hunger Games is that you have the North American country of Panem divided into 12 different districts. The leading character, played by Jennifer Lawrence in the films, is Katniss Everdeen. She's 16 years old. She has a sister named Primrose, who's 12. They live in District 12. Her father has been killed, and it's a dystopian society. It's a future dystopian society. They are contained, ostensibly protected, but they're contained in these areas by these electric chain link fences by the powers that be, the totalitarian government that basically oversees the whole region. So what is the Hunger Games about? So basically, once a year, the annual Hunger Games ceremony is held, which is basically a brutal and deadly version, a sick and twisted version of the Olympics, you could say, where they would have one boy and one girl from each of the 12 districts, 24 in total, and kind of like, I guess you could say, sort of like a deadly version of Survivor. They would be thrown into, they would be thrown into an open area where basically the idea was who will be the last one standing. And sickeningly, the whole thing, the tournament is what they call it, would be played out on something that we would call Skype. You know, these huge television screens where they would just basically watch these 24 kids struggle to survive. And the idea is that your name, how do they pick the boy and the girl? They pick names out of a fishbowl. So in the clip I'm about to show you, Katniss Everdeen, she has, again, a younger sister named Primrose, and I will just let this clip speak for itself.
Now, the time has come for us to select one courageous young man and woman for the honor of representing District 12 in the 74th Annual Hunger Games. As usual, ladies first. Primrose Everdeen. Where are you? Come on up. Well, come on up. I volunteer as tribute. I believe we have a volunteer. Mr. Mayor?
I need to get out of here. You need to get out of here.
No.
Go find Mom.
No.
Grim, go find Mom right now.
No.
So sorry.
No.
Go find Mom.
No.
Grim, leave. Go find Mom.
No! No!
Dramatic turn of events here in District 12. District 12's very first volunteer. Bring her up. Come on, dear. What's your name?
Katniss Everdeen.
Well, I bet my hat that was your sister, wasn't it?
Yes.
Let's have a big hand for our very first volunteer, Katniss Everdeen. Now, the time.
So that is how Katniss becomes involved with the Hunger Games. Of course, that's in the beginning of the story, so I'm not going to give anything away. But as you can see, it's a lot. It's much darker than than a lot of people might think, just based on the disturbing themes alone. Just kids being thrown into this arena to basically to go after each other. Now, as far as the Divergent series is concerned, the series written by Veronica Roth, some call it a cheap imitation, a knockoff, or some type of direct ripoff, some have said, of the Hunger Games. I can understand where they're coming from, but there's enough of a creative flair in the Divergent series, at least in the first one or two, that do make it worth our time. The premise of the Divergent series is, again, it's a dystopian society, it takes place in the future. The leading character is a young teenage girl, and instead of living in districts in a fictional North American country called Panem, as in the Hunger Games, in the Divergent series, they are told where to live based on a human characteristic. So if you live in abnegation, that means that you must live in total self-denial. You are not allowed to enjoy anything in life. Wear drab clothing, very puritanical. If you are dauntless, that means that you are well suited to live amongst those who are risk takers and do reckless things that literally put your life in danger. So that's the whole idea of Divergent. Now, the reason why it's called Divergent is because the main character, whose name is Tris, T-R-I-S, she actually, there are aptitude tests determine which of those you go into, and her test came back inconclusive, which means that she diverged from what was supposed to happen. She was supposed to be slapped with a label and thrown into one of these communities, but instead she became a social outcast because she diverged from what the norm actually was. So the leader of the erudite group is played by Kate Winslet from Titanic and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and the recent HBO series Mayor of Easttown. She plays the villain in the Divergent films, named Janine Matthews. And Tris is basically, she's the leading character. The two of them, as you can see here from this image, the two of them face off against each other. And Janine Matthews, Kate Winslet's character, she offers her philosophy of why they throw everybody into these different categories. She says, faction before blood. Faction before blood, meaning separating families. If it has to be done, it has to be done. And she talks about human nature and how human nature is the enemy. It's human nature to keep secrets and to lie and to steal. And she says, no, the way to live stably and peacefully is to eliminate human nature and basically become robotic. I mean, this is a tale straight out of the Red Scare era. You can easily see this kind of story being told in the 40s and the 50s during the Red Scare. But those were the dystopian worlds. Let's now move into the world of androids and one of my personal favorites, Blade Runner, and another one of my personal favorites, Star Wars, have to be singled out here. First, Star Wars. Now, I do have a little show and tell here. If you can believe it, Star Wars was actually a book first. I hold in my hands an original copy of the Star Wars novel, and oh, guess who wrote it? George Lucas. George Lucas actually wrote and published the novel of Star Wars before the film was released, a full year. The movie came out in '77, and the book was published in '76. And the book gives a lot more plot exposition than the movie offers. So audiences in 1977 who knew nothing about what Star Wars, of course, would eventually become, this movie begins with these spaceships flying through space and shooting all these laser blasts at each other. You see this robot duo who are sort of like a Laurel and Hardy kind of a comic duo, comic relief. Lucas himself calls it a modern fairy tale. Audiences were probably scratching their heads saying, okay, so what's going on here? We get who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, but what's the problem? Like, why are they fighting again? The book answers a lot of those questions much more than the original film does. Now, for the sake of time, I am going to skip over this clip, but I am going to say that Star Wars, of course, became the #1 movie of all time until E.T. dethroned it 5 years later in 1982. And then, of course, Star Wars became the multi-billion-dollar franchise that it did. 3 trilogies, some standalone films, several TV series, comic books, video games, animated series, you name it. I mean, Star Wars is this huge, and I mean this in a good way, a huge monster. So I would like to spend a couple of seconds, though, talking about Blade Runner. I'm just checking the time. Blade Runner, which came out in 1982. Now, Blade Runner is based loosely on a book called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? A strange title, I do realize. The book was published in 1968, written by Philip K. Dick. It takes place, for us now, Blade Runner takes place in the past. It's set in the then far-off future of 2021 in post-apocalyptic San Francisco. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I have read this book. I have it on my Kindle. It is a very, I will use the word fascinating. It is a fascinating read. I would recommend reading it. It's not a direct parallel to what Blade Runner eventually became, but it was the inspiration for Blade Runner. Now, the idea is that, as I say here, stay with me. Okay, there's a world war called World War Terminus, which basically eliminated most life on Earth. There's dust everywhere, so sunlight does not get in. So those who are lucky enough to survive this world war that basically killed off most of humanity, they have the option of leaving planet Earth to go settle colonies on other planets. And the United Nations is involved in these efforts. And leaving planet Earth to venture off into the unknown, as an incentive, you get your own personal servant in the form of a humanoid robot, an organic android. And this android has no empathy whatsoever, although it does surpass humans in intelligence. Do androids dream of electric sheep? This is the premise of the book. Now, the conflict is the fact that in the book is that the androids, they revolt against their human masters. And so that's when the character of Rick Deckard enters the picture, literally and figuratively enters the picture. In the film, played by Harrison Ford, he is a bounty hunter. And what he is trying to do is to seek out and destroy these rebellious androids before they can cause any more damage to human life, what's remaining of human life on Earth. Now, he owns electric sheep. This is 1968 when this book was written, so you have to remember this is years before, Dolly the sheep was cloned. He owns electric sheep. The title really refers to, reality versus, artificial life. So the book raises a lot of philosophical questions. Competitions with neighbors. I have a real sheep, you have an electric one. It's an exploration of human nature and human psychology. As I said, very philosophical. It's a deep read. I'm not going to call it a long read, but I will call it a deep one. You're left with more questions than you are with answers by the time you reach the last page. So when they were going to put hopefully you got all of that. Hopefully the way I explained it makes sense. But when they put the film together, it was director Ridley Scott, who at that point had one of his biggest box office successes with the original Alien film in 1979. He never read the book. He never read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but he helmed the film version, which was called Blade Runner. It was released in the summer of '82, June of '82, against E.T., Poltergeist. Those were the big summertime blockbusters of '82. So Blade Runner really didn't make much of an impact on the box office. It was a financial disappointment. A lot of reasons for that. Competition with other films that were playing at the time, a convoluted plot, a book that most movie audiences in 1982 were not familiar with. Was it too depressing? But were people more in the mood for something a bit more family friendly like E.T.? In the years since, it has developed a devoted following. It has become very much a cult classic. It has gotten in 1992, 10 years after its initial release, there was a director's cut that was released, and it got a sequel. It got a sequel about 4 years ago in 2018. So I'm going to skip the clip here again for the sake of time. But as I said, in 1992, the director's cut, there were some changes that were made. Now the movie begins with Harrison Ford offering some voiceover narration. The 1982 version, the original version. Harrison Ford himself said that voiceover narration does not work. So for the 1992 director's cut, they eliminated the narration. Again, there was a sequel, and it reunited the director, Ridley Scott, as well as Harrison Ford and his co-star in the original film, Sean Young, joining the Blade Runner universe in the sequel, Ryan Gosling, fresh off of La La Land. The sequel actually fared better than the original at the Academy Awards. It won for Best Cinematography and Best Visual Effects. The original did not win any Oscars. And then moving into Wizards and Magic. And here we're going to be highlighting King Arthur, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings. So I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of the mythical origins of the character of King Arthur. If you've watched the History Channel, there are documentaries out there about, was King Arthur a real person? Where exactly does the myth come from? Was there really a king at one point named Arthur, or maybe some variation of the name that the myth sort of grew from? And historians and scholars have been debating that one for centuries. There's really no way of knowing. It's very possible that there were some military leaders, or perhaps even some monarchs before history was fully documented, who sort of were the springboard for what the character of Arthur eventually became. Of course, all of the magical elements, elves and fairies and Merlin the magician and the magical sword and the stone and the anvil. Of course, all of that's fiction. But as far as the fictional element goes, let me give you a little overview here. Once upon a time, there was a king whose name was Uther Pendragon. He was a king of England, a region of England, and he was not a king who really anybody ever defied. There was a married woman he desires. Her name is Igraine. She is married to the Duke of Cornwall. He has this willful desire for a woman he cannot have. That's when Merlin the magician comes in and agrees to cast a spell so that Uther Pendragon would take on the physical likeness of her husband, so that when he came to her bed, she would assume that it was her husband. And that is how Arthur is conceived. He is conceived in the context of this magically induced trickery. Why would Merlin do such a thing? Isn't Merlin supposed to be a good guy? Isn't he King Arthur's mentor? Why would he do such a thing to poor Igraine? Well, the thing of it is that Merlin, as a wizard, he can see the future. He knows that in order for Britain to survive, Arthur has to come into existence. He had the welfare of the entire nation in mind. For him, it was a matter of what is the greater good. It was a matter of the end justifies the means. If this trickery has to take place in order for Arthur to come into existence, Britain will be saved, Britain will thrive. This is for God and country. That was where Merlin was coming from. So of course, in these these times very heavily influenced by Christianity, the Crusades and all of that, so the search for the Holy Grail. he knew also, Merlin also knows that if word gets out that this child is conceived out of wedlock, that the child would be in danger. So he takes the infant from Igraine and brings him to a loyal knight by the name of Sir Ector. Sir Ector and his wife agree to raise Arthur as their own son. Meanwhile, what happens to poor Igraine? She gives birth to Arthur. Her boy is taken from her. King Uther, he got what he wanted. Igraine's husband is killed in battle. Uther then marries Igraine. So she really gets a raw deal in the traditional legends. And then, of course, as far as Arthur is concerned, he is the underdog growing up without knowing who the heck he is or what kind of greatness is in store for him. He's growing up training to be the squire of his older foster brother, who is the one being trained to be a knight, age hierarchy. So Merlin, once Uther dies, Britain is without a king. So Merlin says, whoever is able to pull this sword out of this anvil placed on a stone, he is the one destined to be king of England. And guess who does it? Arthur himself. So he goes right from being a squire in training to being king of England. So this is the ultimate rags to riches story. As far as the historical element, what historians and scholars have been able to piece together as far as where the legend comes from, there was a monk in the 1100s named Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he wrote a book translated from Latin. It's the History of the Kings of Britain. He wrote it in 1138 AD. Debatable how much of it he made up and how much it was based on historical fact, but it is this book, The History of the Kings of Britain. About a third of it is dedicated to Arthur alone. So the character of Arthur reached new heights of fame. This is the book that really brought the idea of this character into the world. And you have to remember, what did people do for entertainment in 1138? They were not playing Wordle, although Wordle is a fantastic game and I love it. They were not playing Wordle. They were not watching TikTok videos. They were not scrolling through their Facebook feeds. They told stories. And if they were lucky enough to be literate in these times, then the stories were written down and they were able to read them for pleasure. If not, then they were just passed down through oral tradition. So the character of Arthur really spread like wildfire throughout Europe and Scandinavia as a result of History of the Kings of Britain. I mean, we're talking Harry Potter levels of literary fame here. He became this national and cultural icon. The Kingdom of Camelot became the epitome of the ideals of chivalry. And as you would expect, we're talking 900 years here of time. The story, each culture in different parts of the world would take the legend and they would adapt it, readapt it, readapt it, and throw their own little cultural spins on it. So there are several different versions of the King Arthur legend that are, written down in, quote unquote literature. And it did reach a point probably around the Industrial Revolution and going well into the 1900s, when the King Arthur legend really became something that was mocked, kids stuff. With industrialization and medical advancements and scientific advancement, again, the Industrial Revolution, suddenly stories about magical elves and wizards and gnomes and fairies and swords stuck in anvils and the Lady of the Lake, and suddenly all of this stuff just seemed very trivial by comparison, unsophisticated and undignified. So the King Arthur legends really fell out of favor for a number of generations. The growing rationality of the Western world, as I have here on the screen, had no time for such fluff. The world is advancing, science and technology and evolution. We cannot justify spending our time on something as fluffy as the King Arthur legend. However, by the mid-20th century, that all changed. And the reason why the Arthurian legends suddenly became the in thing again is because of the success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So really, the Arthurian legend has Tolkien to thank for bringing Arthur back into the mainstream again. And Tolkien's books, as well as Arthurian legend, sort of became the big thing, especially on college campuses throughout the counterculture movement, the 1960s, university campuses everywhere. And the reason why Lord of the Rings was so well received is because, Tolkien was a highly respected, erudite. He was a highly respected academic professor. He was not someone who just came out of nowhere and, from humble art. And this is a guy who, in social class conscious times, he was pretty high up there in the upper echelon. He was well educated. And so you certainly see in Lord of the Rings a lot of parallels with the Arthur legend. The underdog, the mentor figure, I don't want to call it the sidekick, but the right-hand man, if you will. King Arthur had Sir Lancelot, and Frodo has Sam, played by Sean Astin in the Lord of the Rings franchise. Peter Jackson's films, I mean. And then, of course, whether we're talking movies, whether we're talking the publishing world, of course, money talks. So more Arthur books were written. 1958 saw T.H. White write The Once and Future King. I can remember The Once and Future King. I read that for high school. That was on my summer reading list entering my senior year of high school, my English class, The Once and Future King. 1973 also saw a book called Excalibur published, Sandazan Leventhal. So Arthurian legend was once again being reshaped and remolded to fit, more modern tastes and more modern trends. Of course, Arthurian legend got a huge help in terms of a boost in popularity with Monty Python. Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail. So I do have a clip here from the Holy Grail, but I am also keeping my eye on the time. I have a closing video that I want to leave time for, and I also want to leave time for questions and answers. So I will tell you, if you want to see this scene with the Black Knight, just go into YouTube, type in Monty Python, the Black Knight, and treat yourself to some of Britain's finest comedians and their spoof of Arthurian legend. These pictures right here that I have of knights and the interiors of castles. One of the photos actually I took at the Yankee Candle store out in Deerfield, Massachusetts, where they have a knight. If you've been there, it's right by the waterfall they have in the center of the store. And this interior castle photo is actually Cinderella's castle in Disney World. I just threw it in there because it was a great visual to include. So, but again, we're going to skip this clip. As far as Arthur on the big screen, Disney released the animated Sword in the Stone in the 1960s. 1981 saw Excalibur being released with a huge cast, not huge at the time necessarily, but we're talking Liam Neeson, we're talking Patrick Stewart, we're talking Helen Mirren. This was a pretty big cast before they were well known. And then Disney released a kid in King Arthur's court in the 1990s. And going back for a bit to Kate Winslet from the Divergent series, she has a bit part in this one, a kid in King Arthur's court. So if you go back and rewatch that movie, you'll see a pre-Titanic Kate Winslet in Camelot. And I'll skip the trailer for Excalibur. Again, you can find it on YouTube. So it's not like this is the only place where you'll find it. Because I also want to leave enough time to give you a little bit about Tolkien. He was born in South Africa. He moved to England, and this is a photo of him with his younger brother, Hilary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead now to the next slide, and I'm going to remind you that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis at college, they were part of this writing group called the Inklings. The Hobbit was published in 1937. This is a photo of the original edition. I got that off of a Google image search. I do not own the original edition, although I would love to, but I can't even imagine how much it must be worth. And The Hobbit, even Tolkien himself has said that The Hobbit is more of not a children's book, but it's definitely more kid-friendly than the more self-serious Lord of the Rings books. He began writing the Lord of the Rings books in the 1950s, and kind of like King Arthur, you have the tropes of elves and talking trees, goblins and wizards, the land of Middle Earth, these fictional worlds, these whole new worlds, they were inspired by European history and how boundaries shifted over the centuries. So the Fellowship of the Ring is the first Lord of the Rings, but it's part one of the trilogy. And after the Fellowship of the Ring, you have the Two Towers. And then after the Two Towers, you have the third and final act, The Return of the King. And Tolkien retired from teaching at Oxford University in 1959. And he and his wife, they both passed away by the mid-1970s, survived by 4 children. So they do have a family legacy to carry on. And of course, there have been radio adaptations and animated versions of Lord of the Rings, but for a lot of Tolkien fans and for a lot of movie fans, it is the Peter Jackson trilogy that is the definitive depiction, the definitive adaptation of the Lord of the Rings stories. Peter Jackson, a director born in New Zealand, he did Dead Alive, Heavenly Creatures, and in 1997, he bought the film rights to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He had read the books when he was 18 years old and said, I cannot wait until the movie comes out. 20 years later, he said, no one had made the movie. So I got impatient and decided to make it myself. And, you know, we're all glad that he did, because they are among the most highly respected trilogies that cinema has ever put out. They were all filmed back to back to back in New Zealand. They were released once a year, 2001, 2, and then 3. And Return of the King, the third and final one, is in the Oscar history books, because not only is it just the second sequel film to win Best Picture, the first sequel film to win Best Picture was The Godfather 2. Return of the King is the second, and to date, only the most recent sequel to win Best Picture. But it also is in the record books because it won every single category in which it was nominated. It was a clean sweep, and that very rarely happens in Oscar history. So Return of the King was most definitely a crowning achievement. It was a good capstone for the entire trilogy. And again, skipping there. Harry Potter, I'll just simply say that J.K. Rowling, she was a struggling single mother on welfare in Scotland. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was the UK title of the book, published in 1997. The fourth one, Goblet of Fire, became the fastest selling book in history at that point. And again, I'm keeping my eye on the time. As the series went on, it got edgier and more mature in theme. First loves and betrayal of friendships, family conflicts. You definitely have more of a kiddish feel with the first few Harry Potter stories, the books as well as the films. There was one character, I will not reveal, a significant character who dies in the book series and in the films. And Rowling herself said the character had to die. She said, I did not want it to happen. I cried, she said, but it was the only way that the story would work. You'll have to read the books and see the movies to find out which character that is. Of course, Fantastic Beasts, that's a franchise that's it's been plagued with a lot of troubles. We don't need to get into that, but I will say that Eddie Redmayne, who is the lead in Fantastic Beasts, the Fantastic Beasts prequel franchise, Eddie Redmayne is one of the greatest actors around, one of the best of his generation. Now, I called it a prequel series. Rowling herself says it's not a prequel series. It's set in the same universe. It's a separate storyline. It's a prequel series. I'll just leave it at that. So again, I am keeping my eye on the time. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to play for you a closing video. I have not yet mentioned one of my personal favorite fantasy films from the 1980s, The Neverending Story. So enjoy The Neverending Story. If you are fans of the Netflix series Stranger Things, then I think it was season 3 that had a little throwback to this film. The Neverending Story, based on a German book. The author of the book, the German author of the book, hated this movie. I don't understand why, but I never read the book, so I'm sure that they have their reasons. But The Neverending Story was released in 1984. It's become a cult classic, as a lot of tonight's films did. And enjoy the song, enjoy the video. I also have my contact information at the top of the screen again, if you missed it the first time around or if you wanted to take another look at it. But I give you The Neverending Story. I can offer you this little tease as far as Neverending Story is concerned. Noah Hathaway plays the child warrior Atreyu. His real life father is the editor of the film. So there you go. And also, if I can offer just one little shameless plug, if you do look at my podcast, I have a whole episode dedicated to the Neverending Story, episode number 7. But what I am going to do now is I'm going to go into the Q&A, and I'm going to see if there are any questions that anybody has. Feel free to type them in if you do have any. And let me see here.
Frank Janice asks, why did the Chronicles of Narnia fail to become a series?
The Chronicles of Narnia. Oh, sorry about that. The Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, so the first one came out in 2005, and it was a massive hit. It was a massive hit. It was released in the holiday season during the holiday season of 2005. The second one, Prince Caspian, they changed the release date to Memorial Day weekend of 2008 in the hopes of just the most lucrative scheduling, and it did good, not great. The third one, when it came out in 2010, not only was the Harry Potter franchise winding down, so there was a lot of hoopla surrounding that, but also the directors of the Narnia movies, the directors had changed hands. So there was some creative differences, not to mention the fact that the third one, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, that one did not do well in theaters at all. And I honestly couldn't say, who knows why those things happen? Who knows what other new movies came out the same weekend that it was released? The fact that in the third one, only 2 of the 4 original children returned. I mean, that's the way it is in the book too. It's not like that's the movie's fault. That's the way the books are written. But the magic pretty much had gone. There was talk for a while of relaunching Narnia. They were talking about relaunching it as a Disney Plus series, but I think that those plans are sort of indefinitely on hold. They announced those plans before the pandemic, so the project is indefinitely shelved.
Patricia says her favorite fantasy or sci-fi is The Hunger Games. Larry says Alien or maybe Aliens. Diane says that she loved the Never-Ending Story. And she also notes that she liked Time Bandits with Sean Connery and an odd film called Zardoz, also with Sean Connery. And I guess that leads me to my question, Frank. Obviously, you focused on the more popular sci-fi and fantasy films, but what are some of your favorites that are maybe a little more obscure?
Well, I'll be honest. First of all, full disclosure here, I will say that I'm not familiar with Zardoz, but I'm intrigued though. It's Sean Connery, is it? So yes, I'm going to look that one up. Let's see. As far as obscure, I wouldn't call this one obscure, of course, but I know I did not mention Dune. I do love the Dune story. Oh, gee, I'll have to think about that. I mean, as far as obscure sci-fi, I will say that, does anybody remember in the 80s a sci-fi movie called Starman? Or there was another one called The Last Starfighter. Very typical early to mid 80s kind of filmmaking styles, but to me, that's part of the charm. There's also one called Krull, Krull. And from 1980, 83, 84, 85, there was one that was, now the title, of course, is escaping me. Of course, when I'm going to remember the title. I'm probably going to remember the title once, once we're all logged off. But I would say Krull, I would say Starman, I would say The Last Starfighter. Those were all good. Oh, I know the other one that I wanted to mention. It's called Iceman. It's a very obscure film. It came out in the summer of '84, and it's with Timothy Hutton. And it is the story of a team of scientists in the Arctic who discover a caveman frozen in ice. And so they are able to revive him. They're able to bring him back to life. And they keep him in this makeshift environment where like the climate would be what he's used to, this artificially created world, I guess you could say. And Timothy Hutton's character is interested in communicating with him as a human being. He sings Neil Diamond's to him, Heart of Gold. But a lot of the other scientists, they're more interested in studying him as a specimen. And so you have that conflict of what, human nature, and, are we inclined to destroy ourselves? Or are we inclined to learn from history? And the actor who plays the thawed out caveman is incredible. John Lone is his name. So that was Iceman, 1984. Obscure, but if you're able to find a copy of it, definitely worth a look. I also didn't mention, and I can't believe I did not, 2001: A Space Odyssey. I had the good fortune of seeing that one at the Coolidge Corner Theater on the big screen a few years back during one of the midnight screenings, and that was an experience to see that on the big screen.
And Frank, you also mentioned something about Chronicles of Narnia. The Disney Plus was thinking about making it into a television show, and I think with all these streaming services and premium channels that we're seeing a trend of some of these popular sci-fi and fantasy films becoming TV shows. We've seen it with Star Wars, seen it with Lord of the Rings. They're going to have I think it's Amazon Prime is doing a Lord of the Rings or Hobbit TV show, and Harry Potter, not a TV show per se, but a lot of TV specials and game shows, spin-offs of Harry Potter and whatnot. So I think we're seeing a trend here with some of these big major sci-fi and fantasy movie franchises making their way into television. But so Frank, it's 8:18. So why don't we begin to wrap it up? Do you have any last words for the group before we end the session?
Just two things, and I say this at the beginning, at the end of all of my podcast episodes. Number one, Lauren Bacall, married to Humphrey Bogart, legendary actress. Lauren Bacall once said, and I say it all the time, and I quote her, Lauren Bacall, "It's not an old movie if you haven't seen it." I say that all the time to my film students. Don't be turned off by the fact that a movie may be, decades old or black and white. If you haven't seen it, it's not an old movie. The other thing is, and this is something that I made up, it's corny, but it works for me. Keep on screening. Keep on seeing movies.
There you go. Good words there, Frank. So we'll see Frank a week from tonight on Wednesday, February 2nd, for his film adaptations of horror books and horror stories. So looking forward to that. Hopefully many of you can make that one as well. So thank you so much, Frank, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Yep.
Have a great night. Thank you.
You too.